might have heard of. He's done a lot of photographic books, a well-known Oklahoma photographer. He took a picture of the courthouse, but he also took pictures of people around the courthouse, bailiffs, sheriffs, lawyers, judges, whatever. And just to give you an idea to start, this courthouse that you're looking at is in Roger Mills County, which is in far western Oklahoma. I don't guess you all can see it. Can you see it? Okay. And you'll see it's unusual because it has a vault there, a fireproof vault that was built in 1907. And this is the third courthouse, and one of them burned down in 1917, and it survived it. Now, all of you are thinking right now, oh my God, is this guy going to talk for 30 minutes about what courthouses look like and how old they are and who built them and all that? And that's exactly what we thought. So we said, it's got to be more interesting than that. So in each county, I wrote a story about something that happened in the courthouse that was far more interesting than how big it was, and how old it was, and all that. This is the courthouse in Blaine County, which is Watonga. And this is a homegrown Oklahoma fighting rooster. And you probably didn't know this, and you'll probably be surprised, but until 2002 in this state, the law was that a rooster wasn't an animal. Now, we don't know whether it was a vegetable or a mineral, but what happened was that a gentleman in that county, in Blaine County, was convicted of fighting roosters, and it was appealed to the Court of Criminal Appeals. And they reversed the decision on the grounds that a rooster was an animal, so it didn't violate the law. Now, let's see here. And what they said was, they quoted the Bible, they quoted Abraham Lincoln, they talked about how George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and all but persons were cockfighters. And let me read you just in a minute what I thought I had this out. I apologize. And what they said, they quoted Abraham Lincoln. And they said, it is reported that Abraham Lincoln said to a group of citizens who wished to wipe out gamecock fighting by federal law, as long as the Almighty permitted intelligent men created in his image and likeness to fight in public and kill each other, while the world looks on approvingly, it's not for me to deprive chickens of the same privilege. And that's quoted directly from an Oklahoma case. Now, subsequent to that, there were people all over the state that wanted to try and get rid of cockfighting. Not everyone, but by far, there were a lot of people that were for it, particularly in the rural areas. And one legislature brought a bill to try and outlaw cockfighting, and it came up in the 1970s in the Oklahoma legislature. And I just happened to be there at the time. And this legislature from Tulsa got up and said what a horrible thing it was and how inhumane and cruel and shouldn't be part of Oklahoma. And a legislature from Muskogee got up and he said, does everyone know that the first thing communists do when they take over a country is outlaw cockfighting? Well, I don't know whether it was his wonderful argument or what, but anyway, the bill was defeated. And he made Esquire for one of those remarks of the year, which didn't do Oklahoma any good. Now, this is the courthouse in Marshall County, which is Medill. In Medill, in 1928, the county attorney and the county the county attorney and the sheriff had a feud going. They just really disliked each other. And that was before we had districts. We had counties. Every county had a sheriff and a county attorney. And the county attorney was so afraid of the sheriff that he had a big metal vest that weighed 20 pounds made, and he wore it under his suit because he didn't want people to know it was there. Well, how could they not know it was there? It was weighed 20 pounds. He was probably stumped over like this. But anyway, one day in a county commissioners meeting, they had an argument over a $52 travel claim that the sheriff filed. And the county attorney went out, got a gun, and came back into the meeting. Sheriff told him to drop it. He didn't drop it, and the sheriff shot 3 times. And one of the bullets pinged off of the metal vest, went into his stomach, and killed it. And right in the courthouse. So you'll probably wonder, what would we write about Payne County? Well, so it had to be, of course, something to do with the courthouse, which you see there, part of it. But we wanted it to involve OSU because the history, obviously, as you all know better than anyone, of OSU is so involved with the county. So at the time this book, that we came out with a book, which was a few years ago, that was when there was all the improvements made to Boone Pickens Stadium. And there was a case, which most of you or all of you remember, where the university went out and tried to buy up all the land, and they were able to negotiate and buy the land from everybody except one landowner. And that landowner, they had to condemn that landowner, and the landowner held out for an outrageous price and challenged the board of trustees of OSU on the grounds that they did not have a majority of farmers on the board, and that they didn't have the authority to bring a condemnation case. And they lost, the landowner lost, and OSU got it. Now, of course, now you've got the baseball stadium that's been built since this book was written. And of course, you have all the improvements to the Boone Pickens Stadium. And of course, you have a new president as well. That's what this book is about. It's those kind of stories that have something to do with the courthouse in every county and also in the federal courts. Now, this book, as a result of that book, I became interested in some of these cases, or maybe a lot of them. And I thought, well, they deserve a bigger treatment than that. And I would write a book called Oklahoma's Most Notorious Cases. And I selected 6 cases to put in there. Now, you might say, well, how do you select these cases? Well, a notorious case is something kind of like the Supreme Court judge said when he said, I don't know what pornography is, but I know it when I see it. And so for the most part, it's just whatever I saw that I thought it was. But you all will all know of notorious cases. For instance, if I said the OJ case, I wouldn't have to tell you who that was or what it was about. Now, if I said the George Floyd case, I wouldn't have to describe that case and tell you it was in Minnesota and it was a policeman and so forth. So these cases, or the people involved in them, were notorious to that extent. And then each case that I wrote about had to have a trial in it, because what I wrote about, I would write about the crime, and then the investigation of the crime, and then the trial, and then the consequences. And oftentimes they had consequences that were very wide outside of the courtroom. For instance, this gentleman here with the handcuffs on, surrounded by FBI agents, is Machine Gun Kelly. And he's being led there by a group of FBI agents. The second guy on the right with the glasses was the agent in charge of the Oklahoma City office. His name was Colvin at the time in 1933. Well, in 1933, Kelly, who was a notorious bank robber, and his gang kidnapped an Oklahoma City oil man named Charles Urschel. And they blindfolded him, they chained him, they threw him in the back of a car, and they took him down to Texas. And they put him in a shack down there on a farm. And even though he was blindfolded and chained the whole time he was there, he collected clues that led to the FBI being able to find who did it and to catch it. And it turned out to be a case that was a first in many ways. It was the first big victory for the FBI in what J. Edgar Hoover called the war on crime. That really started in 1933 with the Kansas City Massacre, which was just what it sounded like. It was some hoods up in Kansas City trying to free another hood with machine guns, and they killed 4 law officers up there. And before that, in the 30s, there were a lot of people that were sort of ambivalent or friendly towards bank robbers because times were so bad and they realized people needed money and they hated the banks. But anyway, this was the first big case in that regard. It was the first case where cameras were allowed in a courtroom. And that was the federal court in Oklahoma City that still remains there. It was the first case where a suspect was flown on an airplane. Kelly was captured in Memphis and flown to Oklahoma City. Now, he wasn't really the mastermind of the gang. The mastermind of the gang was this woman who was his wife. Her name was Catherine Kelly. And she married him when he was just a small-time hood. He was a bootlegger, small-time bank robber, and she wanted to be married to a big-time hood. That was her idea of importance. So she went out and bought him a machine gun and named him Machine Gun Kelly. Well, there's no evidence that he ever used the machine gun. He used it to stick up to kidnap Urshel, but there's no, and he may have stuck up some banks, but there's no evidence he ever shot anybody with it, even though you'll see movies where James Cagney or somebody playing Machine Gun Kelly will kill 40 people or something. But she was the mastermind. And when it was, you see here Kelly, and you see him holding that handkerchief to his head. Well, courts were run a little bit differently then, and police relations with prisoners were somewhat different. He lipped off to a U.S. deputy marshal in the elevator at the federal courthouse in Oklahoma City, and the guy creamed him. He pistol whipped him. So he spent part of the trial there nursing his head. All of the parties were convicted. All of them were sent to prison. Kelly died in prison. And the whole thing, from the time of the crime to the time that they sent them to prison, tried them, sentenced them, sent them to prison, took 90 days. Well, you couldn't even file the first motion for bail in 90 days now. So that's one case. You all may remember this gentleman, this distinguished looking gray-haired gentleman. That's David Hall. David Hall was the governor of Oklahoma from 1970 to 1974. And the guy on the left is John Rogers. John Rogers was the Secretary of State. Now, what you don't know is that Hall had a habit of shaking your hand and then hugging. Well, Rogers in this picture is holding him away because he's wearing a wire for the federal government, because they knew that Hall was corrupt as a governor. And they, in fact, he approached Rogers about splitting a bribe on placing some state insurance with some people in Dallas. Rogers was much more honest than Hall bargained for, and he went to the he went to the Attorney General and then to the federal government. And Hall was tried and convicted after he was governor, but he was arrested on the first day after he was governor. He finished going to the ceremony where Boren was sworn in, and then he was arrested immediately, and he ended up being convicted and going to federal prison he served 3 years. I think he was given 5 for bribery and corruption. Now, this young lady is Karen Silkwood. I don't know if any of y'all remember Karen Silkwood or something about her. There's been a couple of movies made about her. One is called Silkwood that had Cher and Meryl Streep in it. But you'll see there that she's smoking, which I'm pretty sure is a joint. And it was hard to find a picture of it. There were a couple of formal pictures, but I finally found this one. But anyway, she was an employee of Kerr-McGee Corporation at a plutonium plant, which is now closed, and in near Crescent over in Logan County. And she was exposed to plutonium. And plutonium in small amounts on your skin is not particularly dangerous, but if you inhale it or you get too much of it into your system, it can kill you and cause cancer and kill you. So she was part of the union, which may or may not have had something to do with it. And she was traveling to Oklahoma City in 1974 on a straight, fast road, 2-lane road, clear night, nothing inside, and she ran off the road and killed herself. But there was some evidence, very thin, I would say, in my opinion, but there was some evidence that she might have been run off the road. And this became very sensational. And the reason it became sensational was it was right in the middle of the anti-nuclear movement, when people were marching and protesting against nuclear power. There was a big movement against it at the time, and this was the time of 3 Mile Island that went on. And then it was the beginning of the women's rights movement. It was right at the beginning of that, and that she was taken up as a cause for that, and she got much more famous after her death than she was during her life. Well, no criminal charges ever came up, but there was a big civil suit in Oklahoma City and a judgment rendered against Kerr-McGee for $10 million, which at the time was a lot of money, and was later reversed and settled. But this was a case that had notoriety outside of Oklahoma. In fact, all over the world. And that's why I chose that case. Plus, I wanted to put one civil case in the book. Now, this fellow here, who is well-dressed in a suit, that's Gene Leroy Hart. And the guy in front of him with the cowboy hat is the sheriff of Mays County. His name was Pete Weaver. And in 1977, there were 3 little Girl Scouts from Tulsa, 8, 9, and 10 years old, that were sexually molested and brutally murdered at a Girl Scout camp not too far from Locust Grove, over in the eastern part of the state. And here's a case that many of you remember. If I said to you the Girl Scout murders, well, some of us older gentlemen would know what that was. Now, that's been a long time, 1977, so many of you wouldn't. But anyway, Hart was an interesting character, and this case had racial implications because he was a full-blooded Cherokee, and he had been convicted of previous crimes, and he was serving in McAllister. But he had been taken back over to the Mays County Jail, and he was temporarily for some motion hearing or something on his case, and he escaped. And he escaped for 4 years, and he was living in the woods over there with another Cherokee, and they couldn't catch him. And so he made a fool out of Weaver, because people would see him at the grocery store somewhere, and they'd say, "Hey, Sheriff, why can't you catch Gene Leroy Hart? I saw him down at the 7-Eleven or something." You know? Well, anyway, when this crime happened, Weaver was intent that it was Gene Leroy Hart. There was contradictory evidence. It might have been, it might not have been, but and all the Cherokees thought he was innocent. And most of the other people over there thought he was guilty and in the state. Well, he was tried to a jury, and he was found not guilty. And but he was returned to McAllister for his other crimes. And within a month, he was dead. which was ruled to be a heart attack, and may or may not have been, or somebody may have killed him. And this crime, as well as another one I'm going to talk to you about, you have to realize it was before DNA. So there was none of this forensic science evidence that you see now so much, that where you say, well, this is the guy or this isn't the guy. It was much more guesswork. Experts were not really very expert. In this case, there was a lot of testimony about hair follicles and stuff, which was probably just junk science, probably didn't amount to anything. But anyway, he was found not guilty. But that case was a well-known case. Now, this woman is named Verna Stafford, and she's holding a gun there. And she's the wife of a guy named Roger Dale Stafford. And in 1978, Roger Dale Stafford and his brother and Verna went in to rob a sirloin stockade restaurant in South Oklahoma City. And they ended up pointlessly, needlessly killing 6 people, which at the time was the biggest mass crime in the state of Oklahoma. This was before the Oklahoma City bombing. And 4 of the people were under 18 years old. One of them was only 14 years old. They were just kids working in this restaurant at night, and they closed up and they went in there and killed them. And this is Roger Dale. And I like this picture because he was a cocky, self-confident, evil guy. And he probably killed a bunch of other people. They're pretty sure he's done this before a couple of other places, but they never could prove it on him. This case is interesting because they had almost no clues. They had no connection to the restaurant. Their car was seen, but that's it. And they didn't get a license number or anything like that. But what it took some terrific police work. And the Oklahoma City Police and the OSBI did a great job in finding these people. But even then, they probably wouldn't have found them except for Roger Dale Stafford himself. And what happened is there was a guy in Stillwater, a businessman in Stillwater, who the day after the shooting saw 3 people that were mysterious, he thought. And he called and told the police, and they decided they were probably connected with this. And so they had an artist, one of these police artists, a very famous one who works for the OSBI, one of the best in the country. He's retired now, but he created a drawn picture of these 3 people. And initially they were afraid to put it out because what happens, there's a danger in putting out those reproduced pictures, because if it leads you to get the people, that's great. But what happens is if the people, when you finally catch them, don't look anything like those pictures, then they have a defense. They say, well, heck, it wasn't me, you know, that guy in the picture is white and I'm black, or he's black and I'm white, or he's fat and I'm skinny, or whatever. So anyway, they finally put the pictures out after about 6 months because they weren't getting anywhere. And they got a call from a guy. They got hundreds of calls, but they tried to weed them out, and the ones they thought were reliable. And they got a call from a truck driver that said that he had taken 3 people. He had picked them up by the side of the road in Oklahoma City and driven them to Tulsa, and that their names were Verna Stafford, and I believe his brother's name was Robert Stafford. Well, they started checking, and they found that his brother had died in a motorcycle accident before that time, but they found his wife in Chicago. Well, when they finally got Stafford and brought him in, he admitted that he was the guy that called on the phone. He was trying to frame his wife to get out of him. And so she turned on him and testified against him, which under the law was fairly gray, whether she could or not, but she did, and it was upheld, and he got the death penalty. Now, another thing that was interesting about Stafford was, about 2 days after he was executed, McAllister, the OSBI agent named Arthur Winville, who was the lead OSBI agent on it, he got an envelope. And in this envelope was a $5 gift certificate to the Sirloin Stockade in McAllister. And on the back, Stafford had written him a note that said, "I am innocent. You finally got me," and signed it and sent it after his death. So that was a very sensational case at that period of time. Now, obviously, the most notorious case, unfortunately, that ever happened in Oklahoma is the bombing of the Murrah building by Tim McVeigh and Terry Nichols. And you couldn't write a book like this and not include it. But in writing these cases, nearly every one is based on original sources, like transcripts of trials, interviews with judges and lawyers and law enforcement people, original documents and all. And particularly in the Sirloin Stockade case, nothing had been written about it. So you had to dig it all up. The exact opposite was in Oklahoma City case. Reams of stuff has been written about. I mean, books, articles. There was a grand jury investigation. There was a group of citizens that decided someone else was involved. And they did an investigation, raised money and paid for that. But in any event, it was then, and it still is, the biggest act of terrorism that was ever done in the United States by an American citizen, which is certainly nothing to brag about to have on our in our state, but that's what happened. And that was his idea, was to terrify everybody and let them know that could happen anywhere. McVeigh was a very interesting character, morbidly interesting. He was a very good soldier, and he fought in the first Iraq War. He was a gunner on not on a tank, but it was kind of a half-track thing with a artillery piece on the front of it. And he was the best gunner of all the people at Fort Scott in Kansas. And he was dedicated to the United States. But in his own evil, twisted way, he had decided that the government was oppressive. And he thought that when he blew up the Murrah building, he was going to start a revolution against the United States government, and he would be a hero. Now, he ended up being executed, which is what he deserved. And 168 people were killed, and about 800 and some odd were badly hurt. Nichols, on the other hand, was just a whiny rat. He was a little bit like McVeigh in that he hated the federal government. He thought people were going to take his guns away. All that legitimate political ideas, but he translated it into helping McVeigh make the bomb that blew up the Murrah building. Now, so much had been written about it, but no one had ever written about Nichols' second trial. What happened is both McVeigh and Nichols were tried in the federal court in Denver, and McVeigh got the death penalty, but Nichols got life in prison, life without parole. And the district attorney of Oklahoma County, Bob Macy, felt like it was his duty to try and get the death penalty against Nichols. And so he filed state murder charges. He was able to file, because of the law, he could file in some of the cases, he could file state murder charges. And he did, and there was a trial held in McAllister. And after all that, and the trial in McAllister, Nichols was found guilty and got life in prison. So it didn't change anything, but that's what happened. But that's the most notorious case in Oklahoma by far. So, okay. And I, of course, could go on because I'm a lawyer. And so, so I could keep talking, but instead I'll stop. And if you all have any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer.
Is Nichols still alive?
He is still alive. He's still alive, and he complains about his diet, and he complains about everything. Uh-huh. He's serving in a maximum security prison in Colorado. There's a place there. There's about 10 criminals. One of them is the letter bomber. You remember him? That strange guy that was a letter bomber, and I can't remember the others, but they're all criminals. One of them, or two of them maybe, are from the first attempt to blow up the Twin Towers in New York, where they went into the basement with a truck full of dynamite or something like that. And there's another guy, they call him like the bloody killer or something, I don't know, but he's some kind of a gang guy who killed a bunch of people down in Miami or somewhere over drug charges. Not that I'm aware of. No, they committed a few crimes in Oklahoma, but mostly they committed crimes all over the Midwest. And they were finally killed in Louisiana. There was an ambush for them out there.
I have a question from Zoom asking about the Osage murders that are depicted in Killers of the Flower Moon. Do you have any insight into those crimes?
I've read the book, and there's actually some other books I've read before that were done by scholars that did not get the same publicity that book did. But as you all know, it's being made into a movie right now. I'm very envious of that author because he sold the book for $3 million for a movie. So maybe anything I said about it would be from jealousy. But anyway, about those murders, one thing about the murders, and I don't know, it'd be interesting for you all to think about this yourself. Both the killings of the Osage Indians and the Tulsa, what they're now calling the Tulsa massacre, which I was growing up was called the Tulsa race riot. They're treating it as though they were just discovered and that nobody's ever even heard of these, or they weren't taught in school. I don't know where I learned about those things, but I was aware of both of them. I wasn't knowledgeable in them. I don't remember whether it was in school or my dad told me or what, but you might think to yourself and see. It would be interesting if you could think whether or not you learned about those in school. But no, I don't really have any good insight into those crimes. In the book, in the courthouse book, a case that I hated to leave out of the book was a case of a guy named Mullendorf. He was a rancher over in the Osage. They had the biggest ranch at the time in Oklahoma, I think. It was over 100,000 acres. And he was killed probably by his own bodyguard, but they never tried anybody. It was a great unsolved crime. But the reason I left it out is just about the time I was writing the book, there was another guy from Bartlesville who wrote a book about that case and claimed that he had solved it. He may or may not have, and that it was the bodyguard. So I left that one out. I put it in the courthouse book, but I didn't put it in the notorious case.
Allegedly, there was a lynching that took place in the early 1900s outside of Okina that involved his dad, where his dad lynched two individuals who later was shot. A deputy sheriff. Do you know anything about
I can't say for sure, but there's a famous picture. There's a picture, it's a terrible picture. It's a picture of a black guy being hung off a bridge. And that's it. It's over by Okima, and there's a big crowd around watching him being lynched. That's all I know about it. But that picture I've seen a lot in researching stuff. It'll show up and talk about, lynching. And it was in the 20s, I think. Yeah.
We know everything online is
Yeah, right, right.
No, there's never a source in Kentucky. What he got from his dad, I have never.
Well, now that I couldn't say yes or no. I really don't know. But I will tell you that and y'all already know that the internet is just fraught with stories and made up stuff and things that people, whenever you get into trying to really understand history, this is particularly true in history of the Old West, when you get into like, Buffalo Bill or Wyatt Earp or something like that. There have been so many stories told and passed down, and a great percentage of them are false, or they've been exaggerated or something like that. You have to really cull through that stuff. But I do remember that picture.
We want to talk a wee bit about what you brought and then we'll wrap it up as far as your books.
Oh yeah. If any of you are interested in either one of these books, I'll be glad to stick around and sign one for you, and they'll be for sale.
Yeah.